Hello there, and welcome to another Epicast. It is the end of the year. There are different, oh, I would call them, we used to call them writing crutches back in the day. That the end of the year brings many a journalist. You can sometimes come up with a listicle. I think Nate Silver did one, the 51 most important, political moments of the 21st century ranked. Um, an interesting exercise. If and nothing else, it's a good way for certain people under the age of, say, 35 to look at that list and ask themselves, what don't I know about? It is the older you get, the more useless those lists feel. I say that with no disrespect. I think the work Nate put into it was pretty good. But you do all sorts of we have all sorts of writing crutches. Listicles are a huge one. Um, Look, I'm going to do one for New Year's resolutions for various people for my Substack that you can go find. And that's another type of end of the year writing crutch. Well, one of the end of the year things that I have come to do ever since I started doing a podcast, and those of you, I know some of you have been with me ever since I started one as Meet the Press host. First, I called it 1947. That was our way. But remember the early days of podcasts, you wanted to come up with a name that once people understood the connection the name had to what you were trying to say, it was a really clever name. Well, I called it 1947 because that was the year Meet the Press was born, and I thought, oh, what a great way. Well, I always had to explain what the hell 1947 was, and it happened to also be the same year my mother was born, so she never liked being reminded all the time of how old she was. So that's when a producer friend, longtime producer of mine and friend of mine said, why don't you rename it and just call it the Toddcast? Saying, your name rhymes with podcast. So just use it, lean into it, be a middle-aged dad, dad pun it up and just do it. And so I went and called it the Chuck ToddCast, even while I was at NBC and my friends at NBC, when decided to leave, they acknowledged that they couldn't find somebody else to do the Chuck ToddCast. So while I don't own all my archives for those of the NBC days, I do own my name, image, and likeness, as we now call it, thanks to college sports. And but I've had one consistent thing, and I'm going to bring it back. My first year of being an independently run and owned Chuck ToddCast, and that is my What If series. They're alternative histories. Um, I first got obsessed with What If, just to give you a little bit of the backstory here for those of you that are new to this. Um, during when looking back at the 2000 election stalemate, right? The sort of the election that sort of began polarization, right? Before 2000, we didn't think of ourselves as living in red states or blue states. We lived in the United States. Yes, there were swing states and there were states that weren't swing states, but we weren't really living in this red America or blue America until the 2000 election. Well, one of the more fascinating aspects of the 2000 election that I loved to create an Easter egg on was one of the reasons why the Supreme Court was able to stop the count is because the Secretary of State in the state of Florida certified the election. And the election being certified, as Bush being the winner, basically gave the Supreme Court the exit ramp to stop the count. Well, back then, the state of Florida elected their secretaries of state. For those of you who are political junkies, know that the Secretary of State at the time was Catherine Harris. Well, and she only became Secretary of State due to a fascinating, bizarre, not necessarily bizarre, but a fascinating set of circumstances that took place in 1998. In 1998, the incumbent Republican Secretary of State was a woman named Sandra Mortham. She was embroiled in this sort of, I'm going to be honest with you, it was a run-in-the-mill scandal for a Secretary of State. Why do I call it run-in-the-mill? Because there had been one in Illinois. There had been one, I think, in Louisiana. Because in many states, the Secretary of State hands out a lot of licenses, right? They sort of run that aspect. And there's been quite a few of these agencies in different states who have been caught taking money under the table in exchange for making sure somebody gets their license, their employer license to, maybe be it, run a truck driver, a truck driving depot or something like that. All these different things that you do need state certification for. And that's what I mean when I say it was run in the mill. It was some sort of quid pro quo, sort of blew up. But it certainly got enough traction that it was making Sandra Mortham an unpopular. She was the Secretary of State, it seemed like forever. And it was one of those, you could you could smell the staleness on her. She was going to lose a general election. Well, Florida Republicans knew this too. So they, at the last minute, found a primary challenger, the daughter of a wealthy donor over the years, the granddaughter of the same Ben Hill Griffith that it puts his name on the University of Florida football stadium for the Gators. And Katherine Harris primaries her, wins the primary, wins the general, rest is history. Well, had Katherine Harris not run and Sandra Mortham had been the nominee, she does not win that general election. And there's a Democratic Secretary of State. And if the election had never been certified, the Supreme Court never stops the count. And then the recount goes in full. Now, Bush may end up winning. There's never been enough evidence. The biggest problem the Gore partisans had back then is the biggest loss of undervote, was due to this bizarre butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County that made people who thought they were voting for Gore end up voting for Pat Buchanan. And there's certainly statistical evidence, circumstantial evidence to say, geez, in this one area, Buchanan overperforms where he performed everywhere else. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And of course, the design of the crazy butterfly ballot. But the point is, we'll never know because we never did get the full recount. And oh, by the way, the Gore strategy of just asking for recounts in the blue counties is to this day one of the dumbest asks anybody in the business of recounts has ever made. It was just a strategic mistake. It handed all the talking points over. You need, if you want to win a recount, you have to be on the side of count all the votes. The minute you're not on the side of count all the votes, you're not going to win the politics of a recount. Because yes, that shit matters. Not just the facts. You've got to have the spin. So I've always wondered, it's one of my it's a reminder, and in fact you can do this with history, right? A butterfly flaps its wings, yada yada yada, suddenly, you know, turtles can mate with each other that were once male and female, whatever it is. My point is, it is the whole idea of the butterfly effect. And there's butterflies effects all the time in life, our own lives, butterfly effects in history. And it was the reason I liked it, I got obsessed with that is that I thought it was, well, we can do this with a lot of historical events. So I've been doing this over the years. What if Bill Clinton had resigned in 1998 when there was so much pressure for him during the Lewinsky scandal to do just that? Avoid the impeachment. This is terrible for the party. It's terrible for the country. You could be putting that, with the president as compromised, dealing with a scandal. Is he going to be thinking straight? And, there to this day, there's some questions about whether we didn't get bin Laden because we couldn't focus the country on the threat of bin Laden. And we did come close. I remember there were some missile strikes that Clinton had ordered, and Republicans criticized him for trying to wag the dog, trying to distract from the Lewinsky scandal. No, he actually was trying to prevent 9/11, as it turned out, but we don't know this now, right? So what would that have been? And so the point is that what if Hillary Clinton had run in 2004? Well, I did a what if on that. And so, hence the series was born. Look, there's people that have done the what if on JFK better than me. Stephen King wrote a whole book called 11/22/63 that basically does that. Yes, that has been a model for me. I loved that book better than the TV show, though the TV show not half bad. The series, James Franco stars in that one. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't done it. In fact, I think I saw Netflix's. It was originally a Hulu series, but I think Netflix is about to promote it. So a whole bunch of people are going to rediscover this TV show and go, "Hey, did you see the new show on Netflix?" And it's like, it was on Hulu a decade ago. Um, so you go through it, and the thing is, the beauty is every year. Even did one on what if John McCain had won in 2008. And what if the Republicans had been dealing with the fallout, right? That one led me down the road to Occupy Wall Street becomes the Tea Party, but it's the Tea Party of the left, and et cetera. The point is that this to me is sometimes some of the best ways to teach history are to actually go through alternative scenarios so you can understand why things happened based on how things could have been. So, which leads me to this year's series of what ifs. I'm going to do just two episodes of them. But one of them, this one, is actually two what ifs in one because in some ways they're totally interconnected. It's a you might be surprised. It's a what if involving Donald Trump. By the way, I've done a ton of these what if involving Donald Trump over the last couple of years, as you might imagine. We did a what if Donald Trump had been the Reform Party nominee in 2000 when he flirted with running for president. I did a what if Donald Trump had bought the Buffalo Bills. And he doesn't run for president if he buys the Buffalo Bills. Yes, I did that one as well. So I've done a variety of what ifs on Donald Trump, including the 2016 what ifs. But this year, when I asked for suggestions, there was an overwhelming amount of suggestions for one what if. And it's the one that's staring us all in the face as we deal with the Trump second term, which is simply what if Trump had won in 2020? Or alternatively, what if Trump had accepted his defeat in a normal way, the way pretty much every other losing candidate for president had accepted defeat in the modern era? So the point is that we're going to tackle sort of both at the same time. And I think by doing it this way, and here, I am not here, I want to sort of explain what the What If series is meant to do and what it's not meant to do. I'm not going to sit here and be definitive that if this doesn't happen, this would have happened. What this is designed to do is to sort of ask a certain set of questions that, okay, we ended up taking this fork in the road. What are the potential scenarios of what would happen if we took this fork in the road? And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of that preview, a little bit of that origin story for those of you that have not been involved, but also to let you understand how I'm approaching this. In the in and you'll see that the minute you ask the minute you start down this road, you realize, oh my God, there are 50 other things that are impacted once you go down this road. Exactly. This is what I think this series can do best and what it always has done well, which sort of provides sort of, oh, you know, this is why these things matter because it triggers 19 other derivative events that doesn't happen if event, you know, if essentially uh, event zero, right? It doesn't happen first. Okay, um, so let's get started. The 2020 election is certainly going to be seen as, I still think the 2016 election is a more important hinge moment in modern political history than the 2020 election. But somehow the 2020 election now, I think the question is, you know, I, I don't know of the three elections, 2000, 2016, and 2020, how you order them now. It was a no-brainer to me that 2000 was one of those incredible hinge moments, right? You know, a weird butterfly ballot is created in South Florida, Palm Beach County, yada, yada, yada. A million Iraqis die. Um, it still seems to be, I think, a bigger hinge moment than 2016 Trump or what we got now, which is 2020 election denying Trump, right? But what's ironic about the 2020 election now is there are two different scenarios that would have made it a mundane and just sort of another election where we would have moved on, right? Which is either Trump wins 2020, wins re-election, and we're going to go through this. It's an entirely different Donald Trump, I think, at least at the beginning of his term. We'll discuss. Or there's the Donald Trump that decides, yep, one term was enough. I'm out. I'm done with politics. And then the beginning of the next phase of the Republican Party kicks in. So we're going to try to dabble in both. Um, so we're going to, it said, so we're going to ask sort of two connected questions. What if Donald Trump had lost and accepted it? And what if Donald Trump had won? And how would he have governed a second term? And what would the two parties look like today? Because both universes tell us something important about the republic itself in this moment. And once again, a reminder: this is not about a fantasy. Okay, it's not proving anything about whether you're right, whether the politics of the left or right is right. It's just simply identifying these important moments. Okay, so you won't get definitive answers. You're going to have a lot of open questions, and I'm going to give you various plausible paths. And I hope that, frankly, we have a continual dialogue about this as we go forward. Um, but I do think it helps you understand the history itself. Um, so let's start with the hinge moment. It's November 2020. Most important decision of the Trump presidency didn't happen in office. It happened after the votes were counted. At that moment, there were three futures that were possible. Trump loses and refuses to accept it. That's the world we live in. And that's the world we live in right now. Okay? When you think about the various timelines, there's Trump loses and accepts it, right? That's a different world that we would have lived in. Um, and then there's Trump wins re-election. Now, I've done the other what if, which is what if Mitch McConnell votes to convict Donald Trump? You can go back into the archives. It's the NBC archives. You can listen to that one. Yes, I've gone down that path as well. So we know what one path produced. The question is, what did the others remove from the timeline and what replaced them? So let's start with Trump loses but accepts it. It's a sort of normal election. Trump loses narrowly. He complains. He sulks a little bit. He does what most normal candidates do, hint a little bit at unfair. All these states got to change their rules. Everybody got a ballot in hand. Um, but after 24 hours, he gets over it and he leaves. So what disappears immediately, right? There's no stop the steal movement. Doesn't become a mass phenomenon. We never have the infamous Four Seasons press conference. We don't have the fake electors. We don't have, these weirdly worded question. Well, is Joe Biden, was he elected fair and square? Well, he's the certified president, or whatever it was that the various wordings people would use. And of course, there's no loyalty tests. And of course, what we have is there's no January 6th. January 6th never happens, right? Congress never experiences this physical trauma. There are no barricaded chambers. There's no evacuated lawmakers, no members fearing for their lives. And when institutions aren't traumatized, then they are going to behave differently. And you would have had a more just sort of normal everything. Normal opposition party going, okay, how do we move on? Normal this, normal that. Um, and Trump is still Trump. Um, but he's a grievanced ex-president. He may not be a commander of a movement anymore, right? He still would probably be the most quotable president. First of all, here's another thing. He is no longer deplatformed from Twitter and Facebook, right? There's no rising up demand to cancel him and saying he's a threat to national security. You can't platform him. He is calling essentially for the overthrow of the government. Um, Look, I think deplatforming him was, limiting speech is never the right answer. Okay. I just think ultimately go find another path before you make the decision to limit speech. I'm not saying there isn't a time for that, but you should always look for a better solution than to limit speech if you're a private organization. Um, but ultimately, while he would try, I think, to see if he could keep control of the party, it wouldn't have the same stickiness. His folks would move on. Um, Frankly, think Al Gore 2001, right? Al Gore had a little bit of oxygen in the first sort of 3 to 4 months of the Bush presidency. Um, 9/11 obviously completely sort of wiped any sort of buyer's remorse about Bush. There was a rally around the flag effect, and Gore and the whole Gore Bush thing faded even further. But Gore, I think we could have a debate about whether 9/11 basically ended Gore's ability to sort of be the president in exile after a disputed election like that. Um, but one could argue, just like with, the Democratic Party got behind Gore because he was the nominee. There was never a love affair with Gore, and I think, frankly, pre-January 6th, there wasn't this. He had a base, but it wasn't as devoted of a following. Perhaps would not have looked as devoted of a following if there is no January 6th. Um, but because what did we learn in the actual timeline we lived in? Trump's grip on the Republican Party tightened because he lost and refused to accept it, his whole never back down aspect. So in some ways, uh, and this is maybe something an insight he understood, which is never the minute you sort of admit to losing, then you tell your supporters you can walk away. But by never admitting to losing, he essentially was telling his supporters to stand, maybe to stand down, but to also stand by. It's really great when you get a sponsor that you already use. And guess what? Quince is something that in the Todd household we already go to. Why do we go to Quince? Because it's a place you go where you can get some really nice clothes without the really expensive prices. And one of the things I've been going through is I've transitioned from being Mr. Coat and Tie guy to wanting a little more casual, but to look nice doing it, is I've become Mr. Quarter Zip guy. Well, guess what? Guess who's got amazing amounts of quarter zips? It is Quince. I have gotten quite a few already from there. The stuff's really nice. I mean, look, they have Mongolian cashmere sweaters for $50. I just know, hey, cashmere, that's pretty good. You don't normally get that for 50 bucks or less. Italian wool coats that look and feel like designer. The stuff, I'll be honest, right? You look at it online, you think, okay, is this really as nice as it looks? Well, when I got it, I was like, oh, this is real quality. So, yeah, I'm going to end up making sure I take it to my dry cleaner so I don't screw it up when I clean it. But I've been quite impressed. And hey, it's holiday season. It is impossible to shop for us middle-aged men. I know this. Well, tell your kids, tell your spouses, tell your partners, try Quince. Or if you're trying to figure out what to get, your adult child, what to get your mom or dad, I'm telling you, you're going to find something that is going to be comfortable for them on Quince. So get your wardrobe sorted and your gift list handled with Quince. Don't wait. Go to quince.com/Chuck for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada as well. That's QUINCE.com/Chuck. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Chuck. Use that code. Donald Trump without January 6th, Donald Trump without Stop the Steal, um, is a fading leader of the Republican Party. He would still command a Lincoln Day dinner. He would still sell out any sort of fundraiser that you were trying to do, whether it was in Des Moines, Iowa, Columbia, South Carolina, Manchester, New Hampshire, you name the sort of, the presidential hotspot. Would still be seen as somebody you'd bring in. But you'd also have a whole bunch of other Republicans starting to maneuver themselves to be leader of the party. And you'd start to hear people, we need to look forward, not backward. And it would all have a little more juice, it would have a little more traction. You'd start to see people more interested in new faces, not Donald Trump in it. Because Donald Trump was a loser, right? And party drops would drop him like that. Now, what does the Biden presidency look like without January 6th? Well, number one, he enters the office without the democracy in crisis mandate, right? He got elected because of COVID. Okay. There's no bigger sort of mistaken idea. And then January 6th convinced the Biden team that they had a mandate on something. For whatever reason, arguably January 5th, the both Georgia senators, the minute they win control of the Senate, so suddenly they have the Senate, the House, and the presidency. They got the tri, uh, they got all three legs of the governing stool of Washington in their control. They get the trifecta, and arguably it only happens because of Trump's inability to accept defeat. Right? Without that, is there do Democrats win both of those Georgia runoffs without sort of Trump, complaining about other Republicans and complaining that nobody was helping them? And literally, there was a rally for those Georgia Senate candidates that stopped being about Perdue and Loeffler and instead was all about his grievances. I mean, it couldn't have been messaged worse at the end. But if you don't have any of that, then there's a Republican Senate. Joe Biden comes into office with a Republican Senate, and you're immediately going to have a different type of cabinet that you're going to nominate because you've got to get them confirmed. You're going to have a different agenda that you're going to be focused on. Maybe those $2,000 checks or $750 checks, right? The entire atmosphere is different, right? This is why this is such an important sort of why this is really two what ifs in one, right? Yes, and we're going to get to the part of if Trump had won. Um, but him not accepting defeat just absolutely changes the trajectory of the Biden presidency in ways Joe Biden himself on November 10th of that year had no focus and no agenda, sort of had not envisioned the path he was about to take come January 20th. Right? So, in that sense, it absolutely, in some ways, changes the Biden presidency more than any of us fully appreciate. Because he has to govern as a conventional president. He's going to have to deal with pandemic exhaustion. Yes, there'll be the inflation risk, but again, he'll have a Republican Senate. He'll have to minimize what he can get done. And it will make Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins probably a lot more powerful than Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Um, and it probably means there's two or three other Republicans that are part of this circle, maybe Dan Sullivan, maybe Todd Young, that there's a governing wing of the Republican Party that suddenly wants to work with a Joe Biden that wants to be a very center left presidency, which again, with a Republican Senate, he'd have been boxed into being a center left president because that would have, it's about what you can get done. But instead, of course, he has to become the symbolic defender of the Republic. And everything is this save democracy. And it led to, right, less tolerance for executive overreach, less patience from the base, and a lot more earlier scrutiny. So I actually don't know if it would have been a very successful president because I think the base would be frustrated that he was calibrating his presidency more towards the center, more towards trying to work with if you think you were frustrated with Joe Biden trying to work with the Democratic Senate, you'd have been just as frustrated, if not 10 times 10, with his obsession with trying to work with Republicans in the Senate. And it's possible it would have been Lucy in the football. Right? There's no doubt that he thought he would have deals and it would be, but maybe then he leads with infrastructure in a different way. He focuses on hurrying up and getting the shots out the door, which was the number one reason he was elected in the first place. He's still going to be dealing with inflation. He's still going to be dealing and remember, think about that inflation moment a minute, because it's going to come back to a conversation. And I will tell you this, I think the 22 midterms are a complete and utter disaster for him. Afghanistan still likely happens in a very not so good place. Biden probably starts off less popular. The honeymoon for Biden improved because of January 6th. People were so sort of fraught about it that there was there was a mini rally around the flag aspect to Biden coming into office. And there was a, okay, please turn the page. Let's, and instead, remember, he has to start his presidency with an impeachment trial. By the way, that doesn't happen. And if you don't have, he loses half of his first 100 days because the United States Senate has the former president on trial. That is that is a total, when you think about how much political capital a newly elected president has at the beginning of his term, and you can't use it. So, it's funny when I was going through this exercise, I kept getting mired in this moment because it is, the more you think about it, the more you realize how much the Biden presidency was colored by January 6th and how much the Democratic Party's mindset was colored by January 6th. And in some ways, it both galvanized them, and it may be why they did better than expected in 22. Um, but it weirdly distracted the party from sort of being focused on keeping the main thing, which is just focus on helping people get their lives back to normal, which is all most Americans were looking for in that post-COVID mindset, in that post-COVID atmosphere. Ironically, having less, you know, coming in, those Georgia runoffs, January 6th, it weirdly, it raised expectations for Biden. It raised expectations for the Democratic base, and it became this almost pugilistic mindset. Let's get everything we can get now. This is the moment. Republicans are on the run. Trump's a fraud. And oh, by the way, let's make sure Trump never happens again and prosecute him to the hilt, right? None of that happens. It's very much a more conventional presidency. Maybe it looks, by the way, it may still be a one-term presidency because I don't think Biden ages slower. Because the stress of the presidency is the stress of the presidency, so it's going to age you just as quickly. So that part doesn't happen. Um, and he's still going to pay a price for inflation, and it's likely the midterms go worse for Biden without sort of the ghost of Trump, right? Because Trump was, ended up uh, being an overhang to the politics of 2022, right? Impacting the Pennsylvania governor's race the most, where you had one of his super acolytes end up with a Republican nomination for governor, allowing Josh Shapiro to just walk in, or the whole Dr. Oz situation. I think McCormick wins that Senate seat against Fetterman the first time. Dr. Oz doesn't. We know that now for a fact. The Georgia situation, right? We could keep going down the line. You have a better candidate against Raphael Warnock. Herschel Walker almost won. Imagine just what a conventional Republican would have done against Warnock. Maybe wins without having to deal with a runoff. So all of that, I think, means that Biden has a more conventional presidency. It is probably doesn't, I don't think it changes his one term. I don't think it changes the perception because this economy, in some ways, because it was COVID driven, I don't think you, I don't think anything changes on that front. Nothing changes on Afghanistan. I mean, Trump was going to do the same thing. We'll get to that in a minute. Um, I think the only thing, and this is going to come up in part two of this, what if, is the Ukraine situation. And I do think people underestimate Biden, um, how much Biden was consumed by that. And I still think no matter what, that happens, and he still gets consumed by that. That's that's sort of his first, ultimately, whatever job you have, you lean into the part you feel the most comfortable in as an expert. And when it comes to domestic policy versus foreign policy, Biden was always considered himself more of a foreign policy kind of guy. Um, so it is, I think the impact on the Biden presidency is what is the underrated story of part one of this what if. Um, so look, I think a bad midterm, by the way, also accelerates you would have Democrats announcing challenges to Biden, multiple. because it would have been an assumption that a bad midterm plus his age, he can't run for reelection. And I actually think there's real momentum to push him out. There's no threat of Trump on the other side. There's a big primary happening on the Republican side of things under that scenario. Because do I think Trump still wants to run? Maybe, right? But we don't know how much the lawsuits themselves motivated him to run. And without the litigation, does he end up running? Does he end up having all of this? So there's also a mini what if here in what actually happened is what if Ron DeSantis had not waited till May to announce? Um, I also have my theories on that. So, uh, but ultimately, I think the part one of this what if, the huge impact, the giant impact, more so than anything else, is on that. And oh, by the way, it also means that because there's a Republican Senate, we don't have. My guess is the border. Let's just say there's not handcuffs on Ali Mayorkas and what he can do at DHS, and he runs DHS a lot more like Jay Johnson that he and Jay Johnson operated under in the second term of Obama than what we saw in the first term of Biden. Um, Maybe that's a bit of wishful thinking on my part. But I think that is a stronger possibility that there's just less of a progressive love fest inside that West Wing, right? I mean, the West Wing was absolutely couldn't have been further to the left than what Joe Biden had run as. I mean, it just, and I think the more and more Democrats are acknowledging this, that the most surprising aspect of the Biden presidency was how, and it was the most surprising fact of Ron Klain being chief of staff, was how much the progressive left had more impact on the agenda um, than anybody would have expected from a Joe Biden presidency. You got a staff that Elizabeth Warren presidency would have put in, not the one that I think voters thought they were going to be getting um, necessarily with Joe Biden. All right, so there you go. In some ways, probably Biden looks weaker sooner in this scenario. I think that's fair to say. And I think the Democratic Party is more enthusiastic about moving on from him and less worried about that situation because, Biden really did sort of paralyze the party a little bit because the threat of Trump, the threat of democracy being on the line, there was anybody hinting at Biden weakness was not being a patriot, right? In some ways, that fear of looking like you were helping Trump somehow by undermining Biden, I don't think would have been there. So it means we don't get the Dean Phillips candidacy because there's plenty of Democrats already running. In any, then Dean Phillips maybe just endorses. He becomes one of the first members of Congress to endorse somebody run against him. And who knows? I may be doing a what if here in 4 years going, if Gavin Newsom had run in 24 and challenged Biden in a primary, he actually might have had a better shot at the presidency in 24 than he would have in 28. But because we haven't lived that history yet, I will wait till it actually happens to decide whether that is a relevant what if. But I digress. So ultimately, Trump loses and accepts. I still think we end up with a one-term Biden presidency. Doesn't mean we don't have a Democrat elected in 24, but I do think it opens the door to a wide variety of potential Republicans that end up the nominee. Um, and I think the unknown here is what kind of hold does Trump have on the party as a sort of losing kingmaker, right? George H.W. Bush did not exactly have a lot of say over who the nominee was going to be in 96. So I am of the mindset that Trump's grip is much weaker in this scenario where he accepts defeat. And he acts like a traditional politician. Of course, we'd have no Donald Trump if he had ever behaved like a traditional politician. So of course that may be there. So let's move on to the harder scenario, and the one that I hear the most from people that don't like Donald Trump going, I wish we'd have just given him his second term, because then it would have been Mike Pence at vice president, not J.D. Vance. A lot of people now like Mike Pence. These same people weren't so thrilled with him, say, summer of 2020. So here we are. So let's say Trump wins re-election narrowly. Let's say it looks a little bit like his win here in 24, right? It's close, but decisive, right? Biden won all the swing states in 20. It was very close, but decisive. Well, that's likely what we'd see, right? It's sort of the similar scenario, right? As we find out, these swing states don't just split. Usually they all go narrowly in one direction. And that's exactly what happened in 20. It's exactly what happened in 16. It's exactly what happened in 24. So I think for this purposes, if Trump wins, it's because he sweeps everything narrowly. So um, there's a few things you've got to understand, right? So he's a validated second termer. Um, does he win the popular vote or not? Right? I'm going to go ahead in this scenario and say yes, he does. That let's just assume he gets the same result as he got in 24. Wins the popular vote, but doesn't get 50%, which is the most likely scenario. It's and look, our electoral college is getting harder and harder to align with the popular vote because the size of the House has not expanded, and it needs to. And this is why we are in this scenario where we've had now multiple presidents elected with a minority of the popular vote. That is a bad. That is a recipe for future disasters. The way out of it is either a constitutional amendment that gets rid of the electoral college or an active Congress to expand the House the way we did for the first 130 years of this country's existence until we stopped in 1920. But I will get off that hobby horse. So let's set the scenario. Trump wins narrowly, which means what? Probably holds the Senate by a vote because he holds those. He holds that. Uh, he holds that those Georgia seats. Let's assume he holds one of the two, right? Warnock wins, but Ossoff loses. That would probably be my guess of in that scenario. So you're going to have a Republican Senate. You're going to have a Democratic House still, right? We're still talking. There wasn't enough. So we have a Democratic House. And you have a Mike Pence as vice president, not J.D. Vance as vice president. This is really important. We didn't know how important it was until now we see what staffing of the White House looked like January of 2025 versus what staffing of the White House looked like in January 2017. Well, guess what? Staffing of the White House in January 2021 in a Trump second term does not look like 2025. It looks more like 2017 with some differences. Okay. So you're going to have Mike Pence as vice president. Obviously, there's no January 6th, which means there's no Pence's traitor narrative. He's not exiled. There's no massive sort of split between the two. That doesn't mean Trump is ready to make Mike Pence his heir apparent. In fact, I think it's probably just as difficult for Pence to get out from underneath Trump's shadow here. But the more important thing is that you have a Trump second term with Mike Pence playing the same role he played in the Trump first term. He was a bridge between Trumpism and essentially institutional conservatism. And him being there and being on that winning ticket, Trump's not just going to throw him away right away because Trump still knows without Pence, he doesn't win in 16. Okay. And so Trump knows he can't totally throw him away. So he's going to keep Pence as this bridge. But there are a few differences. Having good life insurance is incredibly important. I know from personal experience. I was 16 when my father passed away. We didn't have any money. He didn't leave us in the best shape. My mother, single mother now, widow, myself, 16, trying to figure out how am I going to pay for college. And lo and behold, my dad had one life insurance policy that we found. It wasn't a lot, but it was important at the time. And it's why I was able to go to college. Little did he know how important that would be in that moment. Well, guess what? That's why I am here to tell you about Ethos Life. They can provide you with peace of mind knowing your family is protected, even if the worst comes to pass. Ethos is an online platform that makes getting life insurance fast and easy, all designed to protect your family's future in minutes, not months. There's no complicated process, and it's 100% online. There's no medical exam required. You just answer a few health questions online. You can get a quote in as little as 10 minutes, and you can get same-day coverage without ever leaving your home. You can get up to $3 million in coverage, and some policies start as low as $2 a day. That would be billed monthly. As of March 2025, Business Insider named Ethos the number one no medical exam instant life insurance provider. So protect your family with life insurance from Ethos. Get your free quote at ethos.com/Chuck. So again, that's ethos.com/Chuck. Application times may vary, and the rates themselves may vary as well. But trust me, life insurance is something you should really think about, especially if you've got a growing family. But Mick Mulvaney, Reince Priebus, and John Kelly all tried in some ways to put some guardrails, not on Trump when he was president, but on guardrails around the Oval Office, at least in preventing too many visits by your Roger Stones of the world, too many visits essentially by the nutball wing of the Trump coalition. And all three of them were really good at it. John Kelly was probably the loudest about doing it. I think Reince was turned out to be, he handled it better than he was given credit for at the time. But a really important role was Mike Pence. Mike Pence was sort of the go-between with Congress. He could smooth things over when things didn't go well over there. He's a former leader on the congressional Republican side. He also had some decent relationships on the Democratic side. So he was really, in some way, Trump's Washington consigliere. Now, do realize that Mark Meadows becoming chief of staff was the first time Trump finally got a chief of staff that let, quote unquote, Trump be Trump. Mick Mulvaney would say he was letting Trump be Trump. Reince Priebus would say he was letting Trump be Trump. Mark Meadows was the one that said, yeah, let any kook in. Because in some ways, Meadows was more responsive to that wing of the party than any others. Perhaps he considered himself a creature of that wing of the party. He sort of got his rise as an outsider agitator in the conservative movement, trying to break into the conservative elite. So in that sense, he was sort of a shared, he had a shared skepticism of the Republican elite. So Trump was getting his first taste of having a chief of staff that was more pliant. But he also still had Bill Barr at Justice. You still were going to have Mark Esper at the Pentagon. Remember all the people that quit. Well, they don't quit if he wins the second term. Some of them are pushed out because maybe they don't want to, maybe Trump doesn't want them there anymore. Or some of them are burned out from Trump. But what you wouldn't have is as sycophantic, when you look at the cabinet meetings that we've all witnessed in the last 9 months, I promise you wouldn't get that same level of sycophantry in this direct second term with guys like Mark Short and Mike Pence helping to at least vet the people that were going to be coming into the administration. Yes, you would have had a Republican Senate that was going to give you more, but you still would have had a Mitch McConnell as Republican leader, who, of course, still wasn't a huge fan of Trump, but would realize that a reelected Trump meant, okay, but you would have had lame duck status start to creep in pretty quickly. And in fact, I want to get to there in a minute. But I don't, there is just more continuity and there's less disruption. And then, of course, there's the whole weaponizing of ICE, right? We've seen this weaponization of ICE, the sort of changing the mandate of DHS away from sort of security of the entire homeland to just being a deportation agency. All of that comes in some ways in response to the surge at the border in 21 and 22. Well, in this scenario, it's Donald Trump that's president in 21 and 22. By the way, we likely would still have some surges in the post-COVID environment. You would have had people wanting to come back looking for jobs because finally things were opening up, right? Now, there's no doubt in my mind they would have dealt with the surge differently. This is his singular issue. I think ultimately at the end of the day, Donald Trump will say the only reason he's president is due to the border. You frankly talk to most Republican historians, and they will say the only reason he's president is because of the perception of the border. both in 16 and in 24. So, it certainly would have it would have been dealt with, but it would not have been. It's hard to imagine it's done with the same amount of, I don't know what else to call it other than the zeal that it's done with now, and it's not having the greatest effect. Then there's of course we're in a remember where we are in the timeline of life, right? This is immediately post COVID. We're still trying to get the shots out. And remember, it's kind of chaotic in November and December of how we're just getting the vaccine, but it's not clear how many doses we can get out right away. There's a there's a line: older people first, those with health issues essentially also first in line, right? All of that. Um, how well is that run? How well does that go? Because we know Trump was so frustrated at how much he thought COVID was impacting his presidency that he would micromanage it a lot, right? But here's another thing that I think is an open question on this, which is because Trump is giving the vaccine, is there more vaccine compliance? Is this does the RFK movement never happen or never get the same traction that it got sort of in that period? Honestly, it feels like it really sort of accelerated in the first 6 months after the vaccine was made available. Is it a different mindset about, vaccine skepticism? I think it's fair to, I think this is what I mean, that the minute you walk down a fork, you realize, oh my God, there's all these other forks, right? Because he's also a second term president. What happens immediately after a president's second term? We all realize he can only serve 2 terms. You also will get a flood of presidential candidates. And the Republicans would be going almost as aggressively as the Democrats. And you'd start to see the early states flooded in ways that we didn't see in 21 and 22 early on because of the whole Trump sort of, you had the prosecution of Trump, the impeachment of Trump, the indictments of Trump, and all of that kind of paralyzed what was normal, right? But again, Trump wins, kind of normal. Well, then, Ted Cruz is podcasting in Iowa by St. Patrick's Day 2021, right? And you have Nikki Haley out there and Ron DeSantis out there and probably three or four more, maybe a JD Vance, maybe Peter Thiel is trying to convince JD Vance to immediately start running for president himself. Um, Maybe you do have a Donald Trump Jr. or an Eric Trump flirting around, and I still don't rule that out for 28 if anybody's keeping score. But the point is that you have this, and it probably starts to drive Trump a little crazy because what people forget is that you have a tiny bit of your reelection gives you about 6 months of political capital, but Biden's political capital, right, got eaten up by the impeachment. Then he gets a little bit, gets the checks passed, and then Afghanistan happens, and then boom, the presidency essentially politically is over for him. So let's go that first 9 months. I'm not convinced Afghanistan somehow goes better under Trump because I don't know if anybody could have left Afghanistan in a clean way, given how we were leaving it, given how we handed it over to the Taliban. If anything, this is perhaps a even worse political moment for Trump. It usually takes one, Biden in some ways got propped up by Trump's problems, and it sort of kept him more politically relevant, though he could have slipped into a lame duck status even faster without Trump there. But being in a second term, if the Afghanistan withdrawal goes poorly, I don't think Trump wanted to be the guy that got out. Um, I think it hurts Trump even more than it hurt Biden because people it would have been noted that, well, you signed this deal with the Taliban and you handed them Bagram and you did all of this, right? It is all, I do this what if about if Al Gore's president during 9/11, do we have the same rally around the flag moment? And I don't think we do because In that scenario, Al Gore would have been, a Democrat would have been president for 9 straight years, which means the Democrats have been running the CIA for 9 straight years, which means, in essence, hey, this all happened on Democrats' watch, right? Where the scenario of 9/11 actually happening arguably both on a Democratic watch and a Republican watch, right? You had, a handover and all of that. So it probably lessened the political finger pointing because of that. You would have had a different scenario. Again, this is why I love doing these what ifs, because you have to not ignore any potential derivative rabbit hole that either did exist in the other one, and how does it not exist in this scenario, or one that didn't exist in the real world but would likely have happened in this one. So think about the first 9 months for Trump. He's got to be in charge of getting the shots out, be in charge of sort of getting us all back, you know, getting the masks off, right? Remember Joe Biden declaring independence, right? Trump, who already had a shaky track record on all of that during 2020. So that's happening. Oh, by the way, inflation, because of the supply chain issue, is still happening. My guess is Trump does want to have some checks because he's knew it was popular. Remember, Trump was 4 checks, more COVID checks before. So, but there's a Republican Senate, Democratic House. My guess is we get checks, but we just get lesser checks. And by say Labor Day of 21, is Trump's approval rating any better than Biden's? I don't think it is. But what's worse for Trump is he's second term, which means that the lame duckness kicks in right then and there. Do you hate hangovers? Well, say goodbye to hangovers. Out of Office gives you the social buzz without the next day regret. Their best-selling out-of-office gummies were designed to provide a mild, relaxing buzz, boost your mood, and enhance creativity and relaxation. With 5 different strengths, you can tailor the dose to fit your vibe. From a gentle 1.5 milligram micro dose to their newest 15 milligram gummy for a more elevated experience. Their THC beverages and gummies are a modern, mindful alternative to a glass of wine or a cocktail. And I'll tell you this, I've given up booze. I don't like the hangovers. I prefer the gummy experience. Soul is a wellness brand that believes feeling good should be fun and easy. Soul specializes in delicious hemp-derived THC and CBD products, all designed to boost your mood and simply help you unwind. And if you struggle to switch off at night, Soul has a variety of products specifically designed to help you get a better night's rest, including their top-selling Sleepy Gummies. It's a fan favorite for deep, restorative sleep. So bring on the good vibes and treat yourself to Soul today. Right now, Soul is offering my audience 30% off your entire order. So go to getsoul.com, use the promo code ToddCast. Don't forget that code. That's getsoul.com, promo code ToddCast for 30% off. So the bottom line is, in the same moment that Biden sort of lost his elevation post with Afghanistan withdrawal, there was already crankiness about the economy. There was all this. And for Trump, I think this kicks in at the same time, because let's remember, while Biden could sort of say, well, that was Trump's economy, give me time, there'd have been none of that for second term Trump. So I do think you have that aspect too. So you have more of a dire view of the economy, more of a problem where Trump owns the economy more with the voters, which in some ways, in the same way that Afghanistan withdrawal pummeled him, I think the economy faltering on Trump's watch there, honestly, is the equivalent of what we saw after Liberation Day in the actual second Trump term in April of 2025, where that is clearly now, if you look back, for me, that's his Afghanistan withdrawal moment, because it is from there that he laid claim to ownership of this economy. It is now all his economy because of, his manipulation of it. And it has that kind of, in that sense, I think you have a politically weaker Donald Trump. Just in general, across the board, he's politically weaker, which may be why so many people have asked me, would we be better off if Trump had just gotten his second term immediately rather than the way he got it now? And when you start to go through this, if you're asking about if you're upset about all these violation of norms, what he's done, sort of America's role in the world, and I'm going to get to that here in a minute, I do think you can make a strong argument on those fronts. So, it is that is something that I think that we also underestimate is sort of is the irony is that Trump's second term is going to be one of the stronger second presidential terms we've had since FDR, and it's because it was non-consecutive. It was because in some ways he got a stronger grip on the Republican Party, which rarely happens for presidents. Um, that their grip can get stronger going into a second term, can get stronger even at the start of a second term. Yes, the reelect moment can be a moment of strength for a second-term president, but in some ways, it starts weakening right away. This has been a different scenario. Um, Here's another thing to sort of consider what we got. Um, we'd have had a different military structure, right? There's no Pete Hegseth at the Defense Department, as I said. So you're going to have less of the tumult. That doesn't mean Trump doesn't want to put his stamp on the Pentagon, doesn't want to put a stamp in different places. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people that try to help him. And it doesn't mean Mark Esper isn't trying to appease him wherever possible. It doesn't mean there isn't a Trump class of submarine that's introduced. All of these things, right? Um, but I don't think we're having an excursion in Venezuela. I don't know, I do think you would have probably, you would have some of the sort of one-off stuff that he has been doing, what he did with the Houthis, I think what we saw with Iran. Um, and I think we'd largely, in some ways, I think one of the, there's sort of two, I think there's two or three open questions here where I don't have a good definitive answer um, that happened during the Biden one term that are outside events, right? The two big ones being October 7th and, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So let's start quickly with, I'm going to get October 7th, because I actually think largely the same way Biden managed Bibi, uh, Trump would have been just as deferential, perhaps even a bit more so. But I don't know if many things change other than I could make a case that Trump is quicker to rein in Bibi and has more of an ability to rein in Bibi in his aggressiveness in Gaza than Biden did, right? Because this is I we've said it before and believe it. I don't know if Biden could orchestrate the ceasefire if Bibi's prime minister of Israel and he's president at the time. I mean, he was struggling to make that happen, right? He'd have a few temporary ones, this or that, but it wasn't the same. In some ways, Trump has more pull on Bibi because Bibi made his bet and decided to politicize Israel, right? I will, not to go off on a tangent here, but if you want to know why Israel is such a divisive issue in this country, you have one person to thank. If you're an American Jew, it is not the left or the right of this country. It is Benjamin Netanyahu and his decision to partisanize the issue. Israel support for Israel was always bipartisan, and every prime minister practiced it that way until this one. And even this one tried to practice it that way until Barack Obama. And so again, I'm don't want to go off on too many rabbit holes here. So I don't think a lot changes on October 7th, other than it's perhaps um, Trump has got a better ability to rein Bibi in faster and quicker, and so maybe there's a slightly less destruction in Gaza. I'm not saying that the larger outcome isn't all the same. Now let's talk about the big one, which is Russia and Ukraine, right? Trump has famously said this doesn't happen if he's president. Um, and that somehow the Afghanistan withdrawal emboldened Putin. I think we all know that the Afghanistan withdrawal had nothing to do with Putin's thinking on Ukraine. Putin's had his sights on Ukraine going back to Crimea, going back to, frankly, when he gave the speech in Munich nearly a decade ago, explaining his warped view of history that indicates somehow Ukraine is Russian and always has been Russian and belongs to Russia. So here are the questions I have, which I don't have a good answer for. If you recall, during the run up to the invasion, America, we decided, and this was a Biden decision, and I don't think Trump makes the same decision, but Biden decides to let the intelligence community go public with what we have. Because remember, at the time, Zelensky did not believe the American intelligence that said Putin is amassing troops on the border. This is going to happen. And, we had to show the satellite photos. We were we did something we didn't do in previous attempts, which is we went as public as we have with our intelligence, and it was a huge bet. And maybe I think it was a good idea for Biden to do this, and for Bill Burns, who was CIA director at the time, to push for this because the CIA's reputation is not the greatest, right? And it was the CIA that said it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. This was a slam dunk. Those were, remember, Mr. Tennant's words. So there is a show your work, I think, trust but verify, whatever cliche you want to pull out of your vocabulary, that was necessary here for the American intelligence community. Well, does a Donald Trump led CIA, who, maybe Gina Haspel stays? She is not somebody that was a big fan of being transparent. I say this with respect. I think she was more of an old school CIA person that, hey, the intelligence gathering is a dirty business. You don't want to know our sources and methods. But some things are better left, that you don't need to know type of mindset. So I think she was sort of old school. So I don't think it's as transparent. Do we warn the world that this is happening? Do we sort of, or does Trump back channel? Is this used as an effort? Does Trump try to back channel and get, as he claims, and get Putin to try to back off? Does Putin appease Trump and only do small incursions? Basically deciding, hey, Trump's no fan of NATO. I think I can drive a wedge here, but I better not do a full invasion. I'll do it piecemeal. And Trump will sort of let me take Ukraine one tiny piece at a time. First, it was Crimea. I'll come in for this. I'll come in for that. But there's sort of one offs. It's not the full shock and awe. Um, Here's what I don't believe. I don't believe Putin does nothing. That's what I think is utter fantasy. If you, again, if the calculation is Putin's thinking, hey, um, if I shock and awe this, maybe Trump gets comfortable with NATO, but if I piecemeal this, I can fracture NATO even more. I can fracture Europe even more. And he goes down that road. Um, and that's the only plausible scenario I can think of that would have perhaps, and I think that, then it might be, we might be right back where we are right now at the situation where Ukraine feels as if it is not allowed to fight back as strongly as the Russians are. I mean, the fact, I mean, it was just so demoralizing that President Trump never acknowledges that the Russians are the invaders. He never acknowledges that, for if Putin is supposedly pro peace, why literally on the eve of what Putin knows is going to be some peace talks between Trump and Zelensky, that Putin pummels Ukraine the night before to send a message. And what does Trump do? Claims that Putin wants peace too, which is, Putin has a funny way of showing it. That is not what peace seekers, that's not how peace seekers behave. So I think that um, that's the one, if it is that in some ways it's a more sinister version of how, and it might weirdly, this might be the mistake Putin made. I think the mistake Putin made was thinking he could win this conventionally, when actually, if he had done it a small bit at a time, where Ukraine never went on permanent war footing, they don't get the same pushback. I don't know on that one, and I don't want to sit here and try to make up a definitive answer and say this is for sure how it would go. Um, I think the open questions I have about the pre-invasion period is whether, one, America goes as public about it and sort of, alerts the Europeans. Remember, the Europeans didn't fully buy in that we had this, and then more of them confirmed our intelligence, right? That was an important moment of unity, and it really sort of brought Europe, the United States, and Ukraine onto the same page, that the American intelligence had everything, and we had this so cold that it's paranoid. I think Putin correctly is paranoid that we have a mole inside the Kremlin. Just like there's all this paranoia that Putin's got some moles. I'm of the mindset there's so many adversaries of the United States have bought off people in the Trump administration that in some ways there may be balance based on extremes, right? The Iranians have somebody, the Russians, the Chinese, but everybody's doing a bit of different bidding and it balances itself out. That's my really dark way of showing optimism sometimes about our current pay for play schemes that the republic's being turned into. But on a less cynical note, I think that's the real open question about Ukraine. So, look, I hope you enjoyed this sort of trip down fantasy island here, where we had two different scenarios. One where Trump concedes normally, and what that does to the Biden presidency, which I don't think we fully appreciate how different of a presidency Biden's presidency is without the cloud of January 6th, beginning his presidency with an impeachment trial, all of those things, right? If none of that happens, it really changes the Biden presidency. And oh, by the way, maybe he doesn't have the full trifecta, right? It is the post election behavior by Donald Trump really sort of changed the trajectory of two presidencies, because the Trump second term that we're experiencing is far different. Okay. Is it is there less guardrails in a second Trump presidency? Yes, but there are more guardrails than the term that we have now has, right? Because we go from, you had the Mark Meadows, which was the first chief of staff that was truly behaving with the sure, let everybody into the Oval Office. That's okay. But you still had, sort of institutionalists, who may have had their own ideological beliefs, but they were institutionalists, like Barr at Justice, like Esper at Defense. So it is. I think you have a sort of cabinet that is sort of half Pence wing of the party, half MAGA wing of the party, right? Um, do I think maybe you get now? I think Marco Rubio might be Secretary of State in the immediate Trump presidency, just like he is in this one. I do think, Trump would freshen up. Most second terms have new Secretary of States. Maybe there's a new, does Mnuchin stay on a Treasury? That I actually think he does. I think he enjoyed being Treasury Secretary. So I don't think that goes away until Trump pushes him out. So, you know, it's just he doesn't, there's no him trying to indict James Comey and indict Letitia James and indict, all of those folks, right? We never, by the way, Jack Smith is a name nobody knows other than folks in the Justice Department and in the legal community, right? Fannie Willis is a name that has no national meaning whatsoever, right? So it is, I don't think we fully appreciate, and I think what this exercise really did for me was, one, paint a picture of just how much the Biden governance changed because of January 6th. And you don't fully appreciate, right? When you're living through it, you're working through it, and then you step back and look. So I think that was insight number one for me. And insight number two is just, it is I think, fairly radically different presidency, not because, for a variety of reasons. One is we don't have this massive deportation force. We don't have this obsession with retribution. So those are two big areas where he just is not he's not trying to. So, he may have his continued obsessions with the press, but by the way, he's still tweeting. There's no Truth Social. That doesn't exist, right? Truth Social only happens because of it, right? So it is, it's only been 4 years, right? Or I guess 5 years now since we had this hinge moment. And yet it's astonishing what happened in those 5 years and how different they would have been even with Trump winning that immediate second term in 2020. So I hope you enjoyed this what if exercise. I hope it inspired, you guys sent in a whole bunch of interesting ones. Uh, I really wanted to stick with ones that I thought could be sort of more open-ended questions, right? Whether it's going to be different. The question is how radically different. And I think in this scenario, we'd have had a radically different Biden presidency had he conceded normally, and we would have had a pretty different presidency, at least on the domestic level. And certainly where the two parties are today, right? 2024, right? If Trump wins the second term, is Pete Buttigieg the front runner in 2024, and is he the actual nominee in 2024? Right? Is there buyer's remorse on Biden? Was it turn out people would say, "Boy, trying to settle for Biden"? All of the hand wringing that happened after Kamala Harris lost, which was, well, there should have been a primary. Da 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 da. I think all of that comes back, right? Um, does Bernie run in 24? Right? Does both Bernie and Pete run, or is it Pete and Ro Khanna? Is it Pete and Elizabeth Warren? Is it Pete and AOC? Um, but I would say the person whose political future probably actually got hampered the most of anybody in this scenario is Pete Buttigieg. I think if Trump winning a conventional second term in 2020 allows Pete to be the sort of outsider frontrunner, kind of like in the Gary Hart position for you old school political junkies, where or the John Edwards position in '04, or going into '08. I think Pete is a player. Is he the eventual nominee in 24? I don't know, but I think he's more of a player and more of a voice and more of a face of the party, and than the version of Pete Buttigieg now as Biden cabinet secretary. Um, So there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. I love doing these things. I enjoy the rabbit holes I go down. As you can see, I went down quite a few of them, and I'll have another one for you next week that goes back a little bit further in our time machine. Not quite as far back as 1985 in Biff with the Sports Almanac, but pretty close. So with that, enjoy the holiday season. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you enjoying this. And please send me some responses to this. We'll do I'll do a special mailbag that's just responses to this what if. If you've got assumptions you want to challenge, hit me with them. Areas you think I didn't that I, skipped over that I shouldn't have. And I will do a special mailbag on MLK weekend for that drop on that MLK Monday. And we'll do that as our sort of what if mailbag episode. Other than that, with that, I'll see you hopefully on this feed in the next 24 to 48 hours. Thanks for listening.